In January 1973, on a morning of Stygian gloom, I called on Konstantin Melnikov, the architect, at his house in Moscow. I had already been in Moscow a couple of weeks, trying to ferret out survivors from the heady days of the leftist art movement of the early 20s. I had, for example, a wild goose chase in search of an old gentleman, once a friend of Tatlin's, who owned a wing strut of the glider Le Tatlin. I even tried to find the man who, as a homeless student of the Vahutimas school, had installed himself and his bedding inside the constructivist street monument, "The Red Wedge Invades the White Square." One evening, I went to supper with Varvara Rodchenko, the artist's daughter, in a studio flat that had also been the office of the magazine Lev. The shade of Mayakovsky, one of its editors, seemed to linger in the room. The bentwood chair you sat on was Mayakovsky's chair. The plate you ate off was his plate. And the fruit compotier was a present brought from Paris by a man who called himself the Cloud in Pants. On the walls there hung a selection of Rodchenko's paintings. In his daybooks, crammed with sketches, you could watch him anticipate and race through every style and variation of the post-war abstract movement in Europe and America. Small wonder, then, that by 1921 he had believed easel painting was dead. And when I asked his daughter whether she still possessed the 3 canvases he had shown at the exhibition "The Last Picture Has Been Painted," she unrolled onto the floor 3 square, monochrome canvases, one yellow, one red, and what a red, and one blue. For all that, my visit to Mr. Melnikov was the high point of the trip, since by any standards the house itself is one of the architectural wonders of the 20th century. The Arbat was once the aristocratic quarter of Moscow. It was largely rebuilt after the Napoleonic fire in 1812, and even today, in palaces of green or cream-coloured stucco, 1 or 2 of the old families linger on with their possessions. Melnikov's house, or rather pavilion in the French sense, is set well back from the street, a building both futurist and classical, consisting of 2 interlocking cylinders, the rear one taller than the front and pierced with some 60 windows, identical elongated hexagons with constructivist glazing bars. The cylinders are built of brick, covered with stucco in the manner of Russian churches. In 1973, the stucco was a dull and flaking ochre, although recent photos show the building spruced up with a coat of whitewash. On the front facade, above the architrave, are the words "Konstantin Melnikov, Architector," his proud and lonely boast that true art can only be the creation of the individual, never that of the committee or group. After I had entered the door on that dark January morning, I climbed the spiral staircase painted emerald green and came into the circular white salon where the architect himself, lying on a kind of Biedermeier chaise longue, was having a grated apple for his elevenses. His son, Victor Stepanovich, was grating the apple. The old man, he explained, could not take much solid food. He was very frail and disillusioned, and when he blinked his hooded eyes, one had the sense of hopes abandoned and lost ambitions. Victor Stepanovich took me upstairs to the studio that on a summer's day must have been one of the lightest and airiest rooms imaginable. But on this day of muddy clouds and snow flurries, the atmosphere was one of liturgical solemnity. He was a painter. His canvases lay this way and that against the walls. He was also something of a mystic and mountain climber, and while we sat drinking vodka and cracking pine nuts, he showed me several pink, Monet-like impressions of dawn in the Caucasus, which struck me as extraordinarily beautiful. When I asked if I could take some photographs of the house, he said, "You must be quick." For what I hadn't realized was that Anna Gavrilovna, the architect's wife, was hiding in the bedroom and thoroughly disapproved of having a Western visitor. The house, as I said, was somewhat dilapidated. There were water stains on the walls. It was not particularly warm. Yet because Melnikov, for reasons of economy as well as aesthetics, had eschewed a slick mechanical finish, and because he had stuck to the materials of his peasant boyhood, rough-cut planks and plain plaster, the effect was never shoddy but had an air of timeless vitality. By the time we got downstairs, the old man was sorting through papers on his desk. By the window there was a plaster cast of a Venus, the yearning of a Russian for all things Mediterranean. He showed me photographs and drawings of projects, realized and unrealized, from his entire career. Among them were the Makorka Pavilion from the 1925 Moscow Fair, the Paris Pavilion of 1925, the Paris Car Park, the Leyland Bus Garage in Moscow, his various workers' clubs, which proved that, like Le Corbusier, he was a poet of reinforced concrete, the plan for a monument to Christopher Columbus to be erected in Santo Domingo, and finally a project for the Palace of the Soviets, half pyramid, half lotus, so wild in conception as to make the linear architectural ramblings of Frank Lloyd Wright seem like so many little sandcastles. Among the photographs from Paris, he showed me one of himself, a dandified figure standing on the staircase of the Soviet pavilion. Then, having pointed meticulously to the hatband of his Homburg, his cravat and his spats, he asked me, "What color do you think they were?" "Red," I suggested. "Red," he nodded. How a private family house, and not any old house, but a symbolic couple duet, came to be built in 1927 in the heart of Moscow can only be explained within the framework of Melnikov's strange career. Kostya Melnikov was a bright peasant lad whose father was a milkman. The family home, known as Hay Lodge, was a cabin 16 foot square in an outlying suburb of Moscow. "Today," he wrote in old age, "looking back on my works, the source of my individuality is clearly visible in the architecture of that building. Built of clay and straw, it looked like a foreigner in its own land, but all the magnificent carving of the surrounding houses yielded before it." The milkman Melnikov supplied a nearby academy where his young son was soon to be found rooting in the wastebaskets for scraps of paper to draw on. The family apprenticed him to an icon painter. His next job was in a firm of heating engineers whose proprietor, a second-generation Englishman, Vladimir Chaplin, recognized the boy's artistic talents and sent him to the prestigious Moscow School of Painting and Sculpture and Architecture. This institution, Mayakovsky once said, was the only place where they took you without proof of your reliability. It seems that Chaplin hoped his protege would blossom into a painter of country scenes, and was a bit chagrined when Melnikov changed tack from painting to architecture. The young man, however, was a wonderful architectural draftsman. He designed schemes for grandiose, neoclassical buildings. He married a plump, pretty, 16-year-old girl from the middle classes, Anna Gavrilovna, and by the time the revolution came, he had already built a car factory. The savage winter of 1917-18 found the young Melnikovs, half-starving, back with his family at the Hay Lodge. But gradually, as the nightmare of the Civil War receded, Melnikov began to emerge as one of the most forceful architectural theorists of the renamed Vykhuty school. His asymmetrical Makorka pavilion was a success among intellectuals and workers. At almost no notice, he designed the sarcophagus and glass cover for the embalmed corpse of Lenin, and later would recall that one of the party hacks threatened to have him shot if he didn't get the work done on time. Then, in 1925, partly for his proven skill at operating within a minimal budget, he was awarded the commission to build the Soviet pavilion at the Paris Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs. With such outstanding exceptions as Le Corbusier's Pavilion de l'Esprit Nouveau, the exhibition was an exercise in opulent kitsch, the essence of Art Deco. The Russians, in contrast, with their budget of only 15,000 rubles, had no alternative but to build light. In fact, the whole structure, which sat on a site between the Grand Palais and the Seine, was made of the cheapest Russian timber, roughly shaped by peasant craftsmen, sent by train from Moscow, erected in next to no time, and painted red, grey, and white. Its plan, sliced with 2 staircases at the diagonal, was incredibly ingenious. Among the exhibits was a small version of Tatlin's Tower. When the show was over, this was left to the French Communist Party, who promptly forgot about it. They failed to pay the storage charges of the warehouse, and the tower sat unrecognized until it was chucked out and probably burned sometime in the early 60s. An English publication, put out by His Majesty's Stationery Office, had this to comment. The Pavilion of Russia was of matchwork construction and was painted red. The exterior was largely of glass, and the whole looked like a dilapidated conservatory. Others compared its aesthetic to that of the guillotine, or said it was a stab in the back by the warriors of the Bolshevik Revolution. But this did not prevent Melnikov from being the toast of the town, nor the great names of modernism, Hoffman, Le Corbusier, Perret, Mallet Stevens, from admitting with great generosity that the Soviets had stolen the show. Le Corbusier took the young Russian under his wing and showed him all the modern buildings worth seeing, among them his studio for Amédée Ozinfin, which may have put ideas into Melnikov's head about building a place of his own. Melnikov was even the toast of the white Russian émigrés, who held a costume ball in his honor. Guests came dressed as the new constructivist architecture. He went on holiday to Saint-Jean-de-Luz, where, in answer to a commission from the Paris City Fathers, he devised a scheme for a multi-story car park for 1,000 cars to be flung across the Seine like a bridge and supported by colossal atlas-like caryatids on either side. The commission, needless to say, fell through. Meanwhile, Melnikov's friend, Rodchenko, who had come with his project for a workers' reading room, far from reveling in the hijinks, detested Paris and all it stood for. The cult of woman, he wrote home, like the cult of worm-infested cheese or oysters, has reached a point where to be fashionable is to be ugly. Melnikov, in later years, said he was terribly tempted to stay in France, yet his peasant instincts seemed to have called him back. He boarded the train for Moscow, where he soon found he had stirred up a hornet's nest of jealousy in the Vachutima school. The denunciations followed, but buoyed by an apparently limitless faith in his own genius, he decided to press on regardless. He built an extraordinary depot for the Leyland buses, which the Soviets had bought from England. Then, in 1927, he set about building his house. He seemed to have hoodwinked Nikolai Bukharin, the party official who put the site at his disposal, into thinking that the design would have immediate relevance to the problem of mass public housing. But, as he himself confessed, the time had come, he felt, to be both architect and archi-millionaire. Given the fertility of his imagination and his keen ability to grasp some feature and use it for his own ends, it is hard, if not impossible, to pinpoint Melnikov's sources. He is known as a student to have studied the utopian projects of Boulez and Ledoux, both of whom designed cylindrical buildings. He is thought to have admired the interlocking cylinders of grain elevators in the American Midwest, which were published by Le Corbusier in his L'Esprit Nouveau. He examined the structure of certain Muscovite churches, and as for the honeycomb construction, whereby windows can be added or subtracted without affecting the weight load, it reminded me of the cylindrical brick tomb towers of Islamic Central Asia. There was, it is well known, a strong Islamic influence on early Soviet architecture. I would also like to think that on one of his summer drives around Paris, someone drove him to the parish of Chambousy to see the Désert des Rêtes, a building that was being discovered around that time by Colette, among others. The Desert, a colossal truncated Doric column with a stack of oval and round rooms piled up around a spiral staircase, was designed and built by an eccentric Anglemain and friend of Boulez, the Chevalier de Monville. It is surely the most imaginative building of the 18th century still standing. Yet although classed as a national monument since 1941, the French government, in its wisdom, allowed it to fall into ruin. The windows of the drum are oval and rectangular, but there is something about their arrangement which seems very close to the spirit of Melnikoff's house. At the time, I didn't have the wit to ask him.